Hello everyone, welcome to this new FPL YouTube channel. It's me, it's under a new guise, FPL Vincenzo. For those that know me a little bit longer, I used to be part of the Man on Podding group, but a few of us have started to do our own thing now. So I've started this new channel, and it's going to be more sort of my passion in terms of watching football, looking at eye test, looking at tactics, looking at matchups, all this sort of thing, and seeing what we can learn as FPL managers and how we can improve as FPL managers. To start this new channel off and before the season begins, obviously makes sense to do a little bit of a recap of last season. But I want to do this a little bit differently. So I've set up a couple of pods that I want to do in the next couple of weeks, looking at some case studies is probably the best way to describe them, and things that we may have done wrong as a group. I don't want this to be solely about my season and what I did wrong. Parts of the things I did wrong will factor into these wider discussion points. But I think there's mistakes in here or challenges in here that we all faced during the last season. So, yeah, this first one's looking at budget midfielders. I haven't put an exact sort of maximum cost on these budget midfielders, but really there's three players I'm going to look at in this episode today. Antoine Semenyo of Bournemouth, Ismaïla Sarr of Crystal Palace, and Morgan Rogers of Aston Villa. All throughout the season at points had good ownership. They're all quite popular as I'll call them 8th attacker. Some of us may have used them as 7th attacker at some points, but we own them. Often we probably had decisions, a lot of us, and they were prime candidates to bench in any given game week. Now, obviously, we have our own reasons why we select certain players to start and why we bench them. But I think for these three players in particular, I think there was sort of a common ground in terms of we bench points from them. So today's analysis is going to be looking at why we did that and maybe some learnings we can make for next season on when is a good time to bench these players. And maybe there's other times when we can consider starting them. So up first today is some fallacies, I think, that we have as FPL managers, some points that we're trained in, we're conditioned to be like, and that may be impacting our thinking. So part one, I think, is price snobbery. I think we all suffer from it, that when we have 8 attackers, natural instinct means that whoever the cheapest one is instinctively becomes the one we need to bench. And in most cases, I think for this collection of players, they're the cheapest, particularly as this season went on as well. And we had, it was becoming clear that strikers were doing so well for BPS, and any goal by a striker was worth way more than the 4 points. In many cases, Chris Wood being a prime example, not a budget striker, but a good example of this, that every time he scored, it was basically 8 points, 4 for the goal, 2 for the appearance, and then maybe 2 BPS, sometimes even 3 BPS. Didn't always work quite that way for midfielders because of the way the BPS system was. So I think it became very hard to bench strikers, particularly if we own 3 good ones. A bit different maybe if we had a Beto from Everton or someone like that. But if we had 3 good strikers, I think we wanted to play them. We obviously have to bench one of our 8 attackers in every week aside from the bench boost. That normally meant that the cheapest attacker got benched because he was considered inferior. So one reason we bench these midfielders. I think a second reason is a bit of a trap that we all fall into. We obviously all look at fixture tickers. The official FPL website has a fixture ticker. Many other sites you may use to help you make FPL decisions have fixture tickers. And a lot of them are done, not all of them, but a lot of them are done on a color coding system based on the perceived quality of the opponent. So those teams that are expected to challenge for a top 4, top 6 finish are considered red fixtures. Those expected to finish in mid-table are grey, and those that are considered the easiest, i.e. teams against bottom of the table, are given a green coding. And I think some people, I think it's the easiest way to make decisions. You look at all your players, you see on the website who's got a green game, I'll play them. Who's got a red game, I'll bench them. I don't think it has to be like that. And I think that's a bit of a trap. And because of the way football's changing, and I think we'll get onto this in later pods, around the poor teams are not necessarily poor in all aspects of the game now. So maybe it's not the case that we should be benching players based on those colour codings. And then point 3 around budget midfielders is that we can't transfer them out. I think a lot of us stick with one for a long time. Again, I think it's good to show patience sometimes in FPL. But we've always got bigger priorities in terms of our transfers. Do we want to make a striker transfer with more upside? Is there a move we can make around budget mid-price midfielders? Do we want to shuffle Mbeumo and Bowen and players like that around? So probably some missed opportunity here as well in terms of the budget midfielders. In the same way, we don't really like to make goalkeeper transfers, defender transfers. I think in a lot of cases when we have one transfer a week, that's not going to be on. That's not going to be on the budget midfielders. So again, we end up holding them for longer. So I've made a couple of slides now around the 3 players in question. So we'll do Semenyo first. Just for those on audio, the slide's got a few key points on there and some basic stats. I'll try and read them out as we go. So Semenyo, I've just done a slide here around his 3 best XGs of the season. And what may come as a surprise for you is the opponent and the sort of pattern of these games. So his best XG of the season was 0.7 in a home game against Liverpool. There was a 0.64 in a home game against Arsenal and a 0.55 in a home game against Man City. Instantly, those 3 fixtures stand out as games where you might want to bench Semenyo, and you think that's a good idea to bench Semenyo because those fixtures would be colour-coded red. They're well known to be harder opponents in the sense that they'll be fighting for titles and top 4 finishes and things like that. But obviously, they're the fixtures that Semenyo's shown the most potential this year. He's obviously got hauls at Stamford Bridge and places like that. I think he got 11, 12 points there. But another fixture where people would have benched him. So a little bit of analysis here on what this might tell us about him and something we can learn moving forward into next season. So what do we know about Semenyo? In terms of his player attributes and his player profile and how he impacts the game, his role for Bournemouth and his role, I think, if he moved as well and went somewhere else, would be that his main strength is his ball carrying, but he's a ball carrier that wants the ball to feet. So what does that mean? That means he maybe comes a bit deep for it, doesn't play on the shoulder of the last defender, tends to maybe hang a little bit wide. So he's got a role in some ways similar to Saka in that sense, that he's dropping deeper to receive the ball, he's staying quite wide, and then he likes to carry the ball. So he's a dribbling player. He enjoys space to dribble the ball into, but is that a good source of FPL points? Someone who's stationed quite wide, someone who's picking the ball up in quite deep positions. He's not necessarily always around the 18-yard box. He's not in central areas where goal threat is bigger. So we have to understand this for starters. And if you look at teams, the better teams in particular, Liverpool, Arsenal, Man City, those teams will look to try and dominate a game, largely with the ball. They'll have good possession in those games, and they'll certainly have a good off-the-ball structure that will allow them to consistently get players high up the pitch. And for someone like Semenyo, that's what he wants, opponents that get more bodies up the pitch, because that means there's more space in transition for him to then pick the ball up and drive forward. If he's playing against a Nottingham Forest or a West Ham or a team like that who defend in a deep block, when he comes deep to collect the ball and dribble, he's got a whole wall of players in front of him. When he's playing against better teams, maybe they've committed a few more bodies forward, the ball's been turned over, someone passes to Semenyo, now the other team are scrabbling really to try and get back into defensive shape. When there's a transition opportunity, there's more space for Semenyo to run into. So it gives him more scope to get nearer the opponent's goal, I would say, against better teams. Maybe more scope to run centrally as well, because if the team's lost the ball, there could be some space, openness down the middle of the pitch. So that's one explanation on why Semenyo's doing better and maybe worth considering more in games against so-called better opponents, certainly those teams that play or like to finish in the top 6. I wouldn't view it so much from a position of where they're likely to finish. I think the angle I would take here is that it's opponents who, when they attack, have good structure and commit bodies forward. Some teams will commit 6, 7 bodies forward into the opponent's half. If they lose the ball, they'll look to press quickly. But if an opponent can get through that press and play quite a direct pass into the final third, there's obviously scope then to attack with more space. And any player picking the ball up on the halfway line could almost be running at the back 4 immediately rather than having to break through a midfield as well. I think that's what Semenyo's benefited from in the harder games. one more key point about him as a player. I don't think he's the most technical player. He's not someone that's really high for ball retention or anything like that and press resistance. He's quite a raw player. And I think that's one reason why he's so cheap and one reason why he's quite inconsistent, because he tries a lot of things. He's got tricks, shall we say, and things like that. And in some games, those things will come off, and in some games, they won't. So it'd be interesting if he did move to a bigger club and if this could be refined a little bit more. But he's always going to have that inconsistency in his game, I think, which because of how raw he is. So again, another reason, if you own him, he becomes a very tricky player, I think, to sort of play 1 week, bench 1 week, play 1 week, bench 1 week. You almost have to take the rough with the smooth and play him more consistently, because the returns are going to be quite unpredictable, because you're never quite sure if it's going to be sort of a going day, shall we say, for him. So I think that's the viewpoint to take with someone like Semenyo. You have to view him more like a more unreliable 7 million midfielder or something like that, who you'll just play every game. And you appreciate that over a period of games, his average points per game will be solid. But predicting which games he's going to haul in is, I think, close to impossible. So that's my take. I think he's going to be a very hard own next year. I imagine FPL will price him up 6, maybe 6.5 million once the prices come out. The question you have to ask yourself here is, do you want this sort of player in your team? Do you want to play him every week, including fixtures that are red on fixture tickers and things like that? I think that's the attitude you have to have with him. I think he's very hard to get right on a week-by-week basis. So bear that in mind. One thing that you may be able to take into next year, 8 of his 10 best XGs this year were in home games. So maybe that's the sort of compromise here. You play him in all the home games and you bench him in the away games. Maybe not so, but again, consider the type of opponent. Does the opponent commit bodies forward, commit bodies into the opponent's half? Will Semenyo have space on transition to break those teams down? So there's some analysis there. And I think most people would have probably got that wrong with Semenyo last year. They benched him probably half the time. And when they did play him, they might have played him in so-called easier games, which might have been against deep block defences and things like that, where probably for his individual player skill set is not the best games to play him in. So here's some thoughts on that. We'll just move on to Ismaïla Sarr, who, albeit was in the same price bracket really as Semenyo for most of the year, is a very different type of player. And you can immediately see here by the difference in his 3 best XGs, where Semenyo was 0.6s, 0.7s, 0.8s. Ismaïla Sarr got a 1.86 against Aston Villa, a 1.35 at home to Ipswich, and then a 0.96 away to Brighton. So his 3 best are all better than Semenyo's absolute best. Why is that? So we look at Ismaïla Sarr's main player profile again, his main player attributes, and he's an athlete basically in this team. And his role for Crystal Palace is to be the team's main threat in behind. So Mateta's obviously the striker, big physical attacker, maybe looks to come deep. Palace tend to play quite direct out of the back from Guehi and Lacroix and players like that. So they'll look to get quite a direct ball early up to Mateta, who's dropped short, try to drag the opponent's defence up the pitch with him to press. He's got to use his physicality and strength to hold the ball up. He then often drops the ball back to an Eze, someone like that, maybe even Adam Wharton. And then their job is then to feed the runners in behind. So that's Daniel Munoz, albeit he's a defender, or a wing-back. His main role is to get forward and be a transitional threat in behind, particularly if he's playing against a wing who doesn't track back defensively very well. And then down that same side, but from a more narrow base, is Ismaïla Sarr, who, again, is looking to run in behind. So you've got Mateta holding the ball up. You've got Eze with creativity. You've got Sarr as the athlete, the sort of player who's going to be the furthest forward in transition, in counter-attack. Obviously, like I mentioned, Semenyo likes to come deep and hang wide. Sarr tends to stay high and play central. It's pretty obvious which one of those 2 player profiles is probably going to find themselves in better goal-scoring positions, have more decent goal-scoring opportunities. I know Semenyo this year had quite a lot of shots, but what's he having? Because he's playing against deep defences that have set and he's picked the ball up in deep positions, he's often driving inside 30, 35 yards from goal. And the shots are very speculative, low XG. So the shot volume is there, but realistically, we asked ourselves how good those chances are. With Ismaïla Sarr, maybe the volume of chances won't be quite so substantial, But I think it's fair to say they're certainly going to be more central. They're certainly going to be more likely to be in the 18-yard box, and maybe in a position where he's got more time to have a shot that's not going to get blocked by so many defensive players. Other good sort of attributes around Sarr is I think he's quite a strong dribbler on right foot and left foot, so he can go both ways. If they do manage to find him in the penalty box, Crystal Palace, I think he's not afraid to shift it to his left foot and have a shot. And say he's got that little burst of acceleration and a few little tricks to get himself half a yard and get a good shot off. So I think that's obviously a promising sign for his output. In terms of the type of opponent he's done well against, no surprise here for someone whose threat is running in behind, that his strong record seems to be against teams who play high line. So his best XG of the year is against Aston Villa. Maybe in the season just gone, they didn't play the high line quite in the same way as they did 2 years ago when they finished fourth. I can talk about this in more detail in a future pod as a Villa fan. But Villa's still largely defending a high line. They've got a bit better at penalty box defending, particularly when someone like Tyrone Mings is playing now. But they do tend to press quite high. So spacing behind for any sort of runner that can time their runs well and get in behind them. Palace have a great record against Villa in general. I think 2 league wins last year, obviously the FA Cup as well. So high lines, and Tottenham was the other game. We may not get that again as a repeated pattern now because Postecoglou's not the manager anymore. But Tottenham historically have played with quite a high line, committed bodies forward to try and win the ball back, defenders nearer the halfway line. And interestingly for Sarr here, 6 of his 10 best XGs were in away games. So again, probably games where Palace are less likely to have possession, games where Palace are more likely to rely on counter-attack, to rely on transition to break an opponent down. So they'll sit back in a deeper block with their back three, protection from the midfielders in front. Because Palace are sitting quite deep, the opponent will be more inclined to put more bodies forward to try and break them down. If Palace can turn the ball over quickly, there's counter-attack threat, there's transition threat. Can they get Sarr in behind? Quick ball to Mateta, little bit of link play with Eze, and then the likes of Sarr and Munoz are away in behind. The FA Cup semi-final with Villa was a really good example of this, where every time Palace won the ball back, they broke very quickly and looked a massive threat. So I would imagine Sarr and Semenyo next year will be priced similarly in FPL. And I'd probably even go as far as to say if one was priced higher than the other, I think Semenyo might be the one with a higher price. But Sarr is one of those players right now, without seeing prices, fixtures, all these sorts of things, who I've strongly got my eye on for next year. I think he'll be undervalued again by FPL. I think the back end of last year, he had quite a lot of games with good XG for a player, certainly for a player of his price, sort of 0.4, 0.5. It was quite reliable. Palace massively improved sort of after the first third of the season. Slow start in the sense of Elise had left. I think they was playing Kamada a bit further forward, and Ketia was being used for a while to try and get him into the team with Mateta and things like that. It was probably sort of game week 12, game week 13 where Palace really became sort of settled, is probably the best way to put it. And Sarr's numbers massively improved from that point onwards. So his second half of the season in particular was incredibly strong. May not be picked up on by the FPL pricing team. So I think his numbers and data suggest he could easily still deliver good returns at 7 million. I'd be amazed if he was priced that high. I think he'll be cheaper. And I think he'll be a really good asset at the start of next year. He could be one of those that you have as a 7th, 8th attacker in terms of your pricing. But I wouldn't want to bench him. I say that the threat he has and the role he has for Palace as being this in-behind runner makes him, or gives him a much higher ceiling in terms of goals. And I say some of these XGs from this year justify that. So I think he's someone that is going to be a serious consideration for the start of game week 1. And if I owned him, I'd want to play him more than I benched him. Final player to look at today is Morgan Rogers, who, again, as a Villa fan, I can speak more openly on. I've listed his data in terms of XGI rather than just XG, because his role, he had quite a lot of goals this year, 14 goals and 13 assists in all competitions for Villa, which is the same as Jude Bellingham managed for Real Madrid. So this is the level of output Rogers gave Villa this year. But his role fluctuates a lot more game to game. Where Semenyo has the same role, where Sarr has the same role, Rogers, depending on various factors, the types of players around him. Villa's team is a lot more rotational than Bournemouth and Palace, who tend to be a bit more rigid and rely on the same group of players. Villa with way more attackers in their armory. The fact they was competing in Champions League and did well in the FA Cup as well. A lot more rotation in the Villa ranks. Rodgers suffered a little bit for that, not because he was dropped. Obviously, played a lot of games, but there was 3 or 4 different roles he was given in the Villa team, depending on who else was selected, and that made it quite tricky, I think, to sort of again anticipate his points because it was role dependent. So his XGI is interestingly 1.09. He's best at home to Forest, 0.95 at home to Ipswich, and 0.84 away to Fulham. So his XGI, so goals and assist potential, is lower than Ismaïla Sarr. And he's not that much superior to Semenyo's XG. So I don't think he necessarily overperformed here, Morgan Rodgers, but he's a more rounded attacker. And what do you want from your FPL, particularly one of your cheaper attackers? Do you want someone who's more rounded, or do you want someone that gives you more goal threat and more XG and more chances? I think he's different to Semenyo in particular in the sense of his reliability in front of goal, Rodgers. I think he's a lot calmer, a lot more composed, and not being so raw. I think his ball striking is a bit better, all these sorts of things. But something to bear in mind with him, that his threat is more rounded. I say in terms of key points for his player profile, a more physically robust, direct ball carrier. He's clearly at his best in central roles, Morgan Rodgers. You've seen for England recently, they've maybe tried to play him a little bit off the right. When Aston Villa signed or had Marco Asensio on loan, there was a need for Asensio's creativity, because we don't have that player to play a through ball. Villa, a lot of our players are ball carrying dribblers rather than slow the game down with pauser, play a through ball in behind sort of players. So I think it was, particularly against deep blocks, having someone like Asensio was good to try and break down that deep block and play that creative pass. But it certainly had a negative impact on Rodgers' output, because he was pushed to I suppose you'd say he started as a right forward. He did play narrow with Matt Cash in particular, getting around him from right back. But it just wasn't so involved in the game. The game's bypassed him by a lot more, and his output was heavily diminished. So something to bear in mind here, who Villa sign over the summer. Obviously, no Champions League for Villa next season. There is the Europa League, but does that have an impact on whether someone like Asensio joins permanently? We don't know yet. So right at the start of last year, and based on what Villa have right now, he should be number 10 and central, which is best for his output. But should we buy a more creative player, should we make the Asensio deal permanent, then I imagine Asensio will share minutes, in particular with Rodgers as the 10. No issue in terms of Rodgers' starts and minutes. I think he's a safe own in that sense as the budget midfielder. But yeah, it's interesting how you want to view him, because I wouldn't want to own him if he was playing off the right a bit more. So just some more underlying data. 9 of his 11 best XGIs were in home games. So another one, a bit like Semenyo, probably seems to be a bit stronger at home. But I say that the bigger factor with him is the role he has and the impact that has on his output. So players like this, I find particularly hard to gauge in FPL. There's obviously some players within some teams who you're never quite sure. I think Josko Gvardiol was another one, not a midfielder, but we know he could play centre-back, he could play left-back, and my next video is going to be on full-backs and the different roles they take up in a match, so I won't spoil it too much now. But Gvardiol has the potential to be used in 4 or 5 different ways as a full-back, which again makes it hard to predict the influence he'll have on the game. It'll be hard to predict the levels of output he's capable of in a game, depending if he's deep, if he's wide, if he's high, all these sorts of things. Rodgers is a bit like that. Sometimes in some games, he's a bit deeper to come and try and get on the ball and drive Villa up the pitch from central positions. Sometimes, if he's off the right, he spends too much time in those Semenyo type wide areas where his goal output is diminished. Sometimes as a 10, he's given more freedom to attack the box. Sometimes as a 10, he's deeper to try and create. Obviously, all of those factors combined make him hard to judge. So I don't think there's any hard and fast rule here in terms of the type of opponent that Rodgers has done well against. I think deeper blocks here stand out a little bit for Rodgers, because it means he can get the ball higher up the pitch, and probably if Villa have more settled attacks against these deeper blocks, it gives him a bit more freedom to drift, a bit more freedom to try and come central. If the game's more based on transition and chaos, Rodgers has defensive duties, has a role within the system to stay wider. If Villa can sustain the possession, sustain the territory, he's now got, I think Unai Emery gives him the freedom to drift around. That can obviously impact his output. So maybe, I don't think it stands out quite as much as some of the other players we've mentioned, but I do think that maybe games against deeper blocks suit Rodgers a little bit more. Just the final slide here in terms of sort of takeaways for these midfielders. So just 3 points to sort of understand from this video, really. The first one is to try and identify the role within the attacking setup of your midfielder. Do they stay wide all the time? Do they come deep looking for the ball? Do they try and run in behind? The type of opponent they like to play well against? Are they a transitional type player? Are they one that's better in settled possession? I don't think it's as easy anymore as sort of tarnishing all the midfielders with the same brush. I think you have to understand the personal traits and characteristics of the player, how that works within the dynamics of their team, and also, in a way, how that's all likely to come together against the type of opponent they're playing against. And then you can make a more informed decision in terms of whether a certain budget midfielder is a good asset for that game. A bit more complicated, a bit tricky, and a bit more thought has to go into it. But I think this is the level we're getting to in FPL now. There's so much data around that the edge has gone from that. I think eye test and understanding more about the teams and players is probably an area that's a bit untapped, and is what I'm quite keen to try and help and support with if I can. It's how I like to watch football. Sort of made a point of that as well in the second bullet point here. Understand which type of opponent suits the preferred play style. So yeah, Antoine Semenyo, no point picking him against a deep block, or it's less likely to bring regular returns because there's a bigger wall of players he needs to break down and beat. And then the last one is most of these players are inconsistent and quite unpredictable. Probably one of the reasons they're playing for the clubs they are, one of the reasons why they're priced what they are, because they're not a talisman for the team. In some ways, they're a bit raw, they're learning, they're developing. So, yeah, they're a bit inconsistent. So these are hard players to pick for one-off fixtures. So we have to show a bit more trust and a bit more determination and a bit more of a willingness, I think, to play these players more often. I'm not saying completely every week, but I think you view these players more as a fair rotation with a lot of your other players. Obviously, if you've got someone like Mo Salah, you play him every week. But from the 8 attackers, you'd probably be in a position where there's 2 or 3 that you could put into a group and say, I'm going to bench one of these, rather than just saying, I'm going to bench this one because he's the 8th attacker. Maybe some managers or you yourself have 2 players that you consider as a 50-50 rotation for who's going to get benched in any given game week. But maybe I think we have to sort of open that out a little bit more now and have 3 or 4 players that are open to benching. Maybe there is a week we can bench a Brian Mbeumo. Maybe there is a week we can bench a Jared Bowen or any other midfielder, sort of 7 million. I don't think just because they're 7 million, 8 million, that means that we don't consider benching them if one of our budget midfielders has a set of circumstances that suggest they're capable of returns. So, yeah, that's this video done. Hopefully you found that quite noteworthy and you've got something to take away. You've learned something. You can begin to look at football matches maybe slightly differently and have a different mindset now in terms of these players and how you want to pick them each week. So I've got a couple more case studies lined up for the next few episodes. I'll try and get them out sort of in the next week or so, looking at both about defenders actually, but again, some learnings for next season. And then we'll obviously be into fixture lists being released and things like that. So if you've liked this pod, please give it a like, and appreciate if you could subscribe to the channel. And we'll look to do regular content over the course of the season. So yeah, my name's FPL Vincenzo now, and appreciate everyone for listening. Thanks very much.